Oh, thank you so much for your time. So you specialize in, is it history and New Testament studies primarily?
Yeah, I'm a professor of Christian origins, so it's really sort of the very beginning of Christianity. So
Ah,
the sort of the context, Jewish context, and the first century or so of early Christianity.
ah, I saw an interesting documentary that you were in. It was about Pontius Pilate.
Right?
Yeah, I,
Yeah, I've on Pilate and various aspects of Jesus's death. I did my PhD on Pontius Pilate.
wow.
So yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yes, I think that's how I came across you, was watching that documentary, and then I've recently read your book, The First Biography of Jesus. And
Oh
yes,
yeah.
I based most of the questions from there. It's really, yeah, really fascinating. Yeah. Oh, you may remember from my email, I've been investigating recently um, Mark 13, Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse,
Mhm. Mhm.
primarily with, I suppose, a lot of eschatology and futuristic predictions that people um, connect with that. But I would be interested to know, maybe from Mark's perspective and based on your book, some of the background to that story. Um, do you believe, as my first question, that Mark was the first gospel, and what year would you place it?
I'm fairly convinced that Mark is the first gospel. That is the general scholarly consensus. And the reason for that is that there does seem to be a literary relationship between all of the gospels. And it makes most sense if Mark was the first and then other people based their accounts on his. So I'm fairly persuaded that is the right order, that Mark came first. And I would date it to the early 70s or so CE. And the reason for that is that I do think he shows knowledge of the Jewish war with Rome from 66 to 70. But also, I think that there are some references in the way that he describes Jesus's crucifixion. Sounds to me like he's also aware of the Roman triumphs that took place in Rome to celebrate the Jewish defeat of the Jews in 71. So that would put Mark's gospel maybe a year or two later than that.
So, would the with the Olivet Discourse, which sort of predicts the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, would would Mark have that event very heavily in his mind while writing that gospel, do you think?
Yeah, I think the fall of Jerusalem and particularly the destruction of the temple was such a seismic thing for all Jews at the time that I don't really think that anybody could have been writing or thinking anything that didn't in some way that wasn't in some way affected by the fall of Jerusalem. So obviously Mark is writing a book about Jesus in the 30s, and so the fall of Jerusalem wouldn't particularly come into that. But I think there are clear references to the destruction of the temple in Mark's gospel. Jesus predicts that the temple will be destroyed very clearly in a number of places. And whilst that could be a prophecy, I think the most likely thing is that Mark is writing this after the temple has been destroyed. And so readers of the gospel hear this and they say, yes, Jesus knew everything that was going to happen. Jesus predicted these things that have just happened now in our lifetime.
Yes. You mentioned in your book two distinct biographies. You talk about the biographical subject who provides the focus, and then you talk about the biography of the writer at work. Does is Mark, do you think, wanting to get across a certain message to his audience by looking at that story? I mean, you mentioned that to be a follower of Jesus, one must be prepared to follow their master if it ends up, losing their lives. Does he use that as a literary device, do you think?
Do you mean particularly in chapter 13?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think chapter 13 it's all about, I mean, the context of the gospel, it's all about when will the end of time be? When is Jesus going to come back on the clouds with the heavenly angels and establish God's kingdom? So this is what the disciples are asking in the story. And I imagine the chances are this is what Mark's audience are also saying. And what's really brought this to a head is the fact that we've just had the Jewish-Roman War. Terrible things are happening in the Jewish homeland. The temple has been destroyed. And of course, people are going to think, well, this is it. This is the sign of the end. Jesus is going to come back soon. And I think what Mark is wanting to do in chapter 13 is sort of put the brakes on that. And he's saying, well, hold on, guys. Yes, these terrible things are happening. But Mark's Jesus says, that's not the end. You know, you might hear these stories. There might even be sort of false messiahs who spring up and say, follow me, but resist all of that. Just hold firm and wait, because the end is coming. So he's wanting to say that end is coming soon, you know, hold on, but it's not quite yet. So it's not yet, but just hold the faith for a little bit longer, and it's going to be quite soon. So I think that's what he's doing in that chapter. And he does reflect things that have happened in their own circumstances, but particularly the Jewish revolt. But he's just saying, you know, it's not just yet. Hold firm a bit longer.
Yes, I've noticed with the coming of the Lord, there is a bit of debate if that happened in AD 70 or if it is a end time sort of future thing. Um, do you think the early Christians uh, would have had an expectation that it was in 70 AD? Would that have been an end of a certain Jewish age, do you think? Or
I can very much, I can completely understand why some people would have thought that the fall of the temple meant that this is the end of the age. It would seem quite natural if God had allowed the temple to fall to the Romans. Then, you know, what next? This is hugely cataclysmic times. This must herald the end of the age. And so I think it's quite easy to imagine why Mark's audience might have thought this means that Jesus is on his way back anytime soon. And I think Mark is trying to walk a sort of an awkward tightrope here, because he does think that there is going to be an end of the world, and Jesus is going to come back soon. But at the same time, he's wanting to say to them, hold your horses, not just yet, you know, just wait. And all the way through chapter 13, he keeps coming back to this idea of watch and wait and stay ready, because it is going to come, but you just don't know when.
yeah, oh, thank you, that's helpful. Would there also have been a sense of Mark wanting his audience to not engage in the Roman battle? That verse when he says, flee to the mountains, you know, get out of there when the armies come. Would that have also been a literary device of telling his audience, you know, do not engage in this violent act, you think?
Well, yeah, I suppose it's interesting to think whether these verses are from during the Roman revolt. Sorry, it's interesting to speculate whether these verses are from during the war with Rome or later on. There are people who think that Mark's gospel was written during the war, in which case telling people to flee to the mountains could be seen as a way of saying, don't get involved in those kinds of fights. And that might well fit in with the portrait that Mark gives us of Barabbas, where it's very clear that there's a choice. Do you go with Barabbas or do you go with Jesus and Jesus's way of being the Christ? So I suppose you could take it from Mark in that case, that there's a sort of an anti-revolt, anti-war theme. And of course, there was a tradition very early on that the Christians left Jerusalem shortly before the revolt and all went off to Pella in Galilee. But if the gospel comes from after the revolt, then I suppose all of that stuff about fleeing to the mountains and wouldn't it be terrible if you're pregnant at those times, is really trying to show just how awful this is going to be. This is one of the worst things that is going to happen. And it's sort of telling everyone Jesus foresaw this. Jesus knew that this was going to happen, but still hold fast and just wait for it. So if Mark's gospel is written after the revolt, then obviously it's not telling the recipients anything about how they should behave during the revolt.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Which date do we put on it? Yes, would reflect his intentions, I suppose. Yes.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I would say it's coming from after the revolt, and so it's not so much Mark saying don't get involved in all of that. It's Mark saying yes, all of that has happened, and that was a horrible thing, and we all know that was one of the worst things ever to have happened, and the temple fell as well, but the end isn't quite coming yet.
And from a first century historical point of view, do we know exactly what happened leading up to it? I understand there was at least 3 years of revolts before the siege. Is that correct?
Yes, we're really, really lucky when it comes to first century Judea, in that we have such an enormous amount of information written by the Jewish historian Josephus. I mean, you have to be a little cautious with Josephus. He has his own agenda, as all writers do, but he was actually part of the revolt. He ended up being a commander in Galilee. I mean, not a very good commander, it seems, but still he had first-hand knowledge of the revolt. And so he tells us a lot. I mean, in fact, great detail. He has a whole book about in 7 parts on the Jewish war with Rome. So it seems to have started in about 66 with a dispute over taxation. And the Roman governor decided that he was going to take the shortfall from the temple treasury. That started a fight, and things escalated. The Jewish rebels took Jerusalem. And initially, it didn't seem like it was going to be anything particularly big. So the Roman legate in Syria, Cestius Gallus, sent a whole legion, came with a whole legion to put down the fighting. And then, very surprisingly, his legion was actually destroyed by the Jewish rebels. So more people joined the cause. They thought, God is behind us. They took over Jerusalem completely. More and more people came over to the rebel side. And the Emperor Nero, who was on the throne at the time, sent another general. This time it was Vespasian, the future emperor. And he came along with his son Titus, gradually kind of taking over the whole of Galilee and then Judea. And he managed that fairly quickly. I mean, there were lots of cities that were holding out, but the Romans quite quickly managed to dampen the revolt there. And so they ended up in Jerusalem in the very beginning of 70 CE, and that's where they quite quickly sort of got through the outer walls, but then they laid siege to the city for 7 months. And Josephus gives us a terrible description of conditions during the revolt. He says that there was all kinds of infighting, different factions. One lot of rebels burnt the entire food supply, so there was great famine, there was plague. And I think basically the Romans were just sitting there waiting for the Jewish rebels to kill themselves inside Jerusalem, which is more or less what happened. The Roman forces under Titus finally took the city in the summer of AD 70, and Titus burned the city to the ground. So it was 4 years, and it was a long time to hold out against Rome. But partly, I think there were just other things happening, and Rome's attention wasn't entirely on the revolt itself.
Yes. Does it fit quite well for what we know of history with Jesus's words? I'm just wondering why he mentions it will be terrible for pregnant women, or that it won't happen in the winter. I mean, it's interesting that you said it happened in the summer, didn't it?
The final, yeah, the final taking, but because the siege itself started at the beginning of 70, so there was 7 months there, so it covered winter as well as the summer. And Josephus's account really emphasizes just how terrible the situation was. So it was not a place to find yourself in. I mean, there's even talk about deserters running away from the city, even facing the Romans outside the city walls, rather than stay in the city because everything was so horrible.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, I think it was pretty bad.
It is true, is it, that the Christians, well, that not one Christian was killed? Is that true, that they sort of saw the warning signs? Is that correct?
Well, that's the tradition that that they escaped to Pella before the siege. I don't know how much truth there is to that. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there weren't some people who were already followers of Christ who were taken up in the siege itself. But it's quite possible that some of the leaders left Jerusalem already.
Yes. And do you know, I keep thinking it's just in Matthew's gospel, but I think it is in Mark as well, the abomination that causes desolation in Mark 13. Do you know exactly what Mark is referring to? Is it, is the abomination the Romans coming into the temple? Do we know?
Well, there's been huge amounts of scholarly discussion about that. And obviously, Mark's audience do know, because right after that, Mark says, let the reader understand. So it's a kind of a wink to the audience. You know what I'm meaning here. So it must be a fairly big event, I would imagine. And there are various suggestions. The one I think has most to it is the suggestion that after the temple had been destroyed, the Romans set up their standards and bowed down to them. And Roman legionaries and also auxiliary troops worshipped their standards. And so, of course, they worship them before a battle, and then they give thanks to the gods after a battle. And I think it's most likely that it's something to do with this. So once the temple had been burnt, the Romans put up their standards. And this, of course, is sacred ground. This is the very heart of Jerusalem, where the temple would have stood. And so I think this is seen as sacrilege, because the phrase abomination of desolation goes back to Daniel, the book of Daniel, where the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the Jerusalem temple by putting up a statue of Zeus on the altar. And so it does seem to be something to do with sacrilege and altars. And I think that makes most sense of why Mark quotes that old verse. So people think, yes, this is sort of the equivalent to what happened way back then.
Ah, yes. And it's correct that, did they try to put a statue of Caligula in 40 CE as well in the temple?
Yes, Gaius Caligula himself wanted to put up a statue of himself in around about 40 CE. And he asked the legate of Syria to do it, a chap called Petronius. Luckily, Petronius was a little bit more aware of what the Jewish reaction might have been to that than Gaius himself seems to have been. And there was quite a lot of discussion on either side, with, of course, Jewish authorities and the Jewish people themselves up in arms about this and saying, we can't possibly have a statue of Caligula in the temple. This would be the uttermost sacrilege. And luckily, I suppose, negotiations went on for such a long time that Caligula died, and with him died the order to set up his statue. So that never happened. But had it happened, I mean, we could have had the whole Jewish war, 20, 25 years earlier.
Yeah, sort of an inevitable thing, it sounds like, doesn't it?
Yes, I don't think anybody would have taken a statue of Caligula in the temple lying down. They would have all taken up arms, and then I think exactly what happened later would have happened just a little bit sooner.
Yes. I was just wondering, I know Paul, so presumably if he's writing before Mark, talks about the people of God being this new temple, the temple of God. Would Mark have reflected that in his writings, do you think, now that the physical building is gone, the people were the temple? Um,
Yes, I think that's very much a theme in Mark because it comes out particularly in Jesus's trial narrative in front of the Jews, where um, the Jewish authorities have stirred up false prophets to say that he said that he will destroy the temple made with hands and raise up another one not made by hands. And I mean, of course, Jesus hasn't said those precise words in the rest of the gospel, but what I think Mark intends us to understand there is that this temple not made with hands is the Christian community that's going to be established 3 days after Jesus's resurrection. So, or at least with Jesus's resurrection, 3 days after the crucifixion. So I think that's a very sort of elusive reference to the Christian community, which now sees itself as the new temple. And like you say, that was an idea that was already there in Paul, but I suppose takes on particular resonance when the temple itself has fallen, because whilst Jewish people might have been really upset by the loss of the temple, for Christians, they can say, well, we don't really need the temple anymore because we are the new temple.
yes, yes. And um, would would there have been a sense of, I suppose we know from gospel writers they sort of added their own, I don't know if agenda is the right word, because they were writing to a particular audience. I suppose my question would be, did things either get lost or get changed as the other gospels came in from what Mark originally started with? Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yes, I think very much so. They all reproduce Mark in various ways. Matthew and Luke are pretty close to Mark. John, I think, uses Mark in a much less specific kind of way. He's quite happy to adapt Mark quite extensively. But in all cases, you can tell by the way that they're changing Mark that they always change him in accordance with their own particular interests. And so that does show, I think, a sort of an intelligent, creative use of Mark to update Mark in a way, because if Mark is writing in the early 70s, we don't know for sure when Matthew and Luke were writing, but maybe in the 80s, 90s, even early hundreds, and John too. So they're all very keen on Mark, but they all want to update him so that he speaks more directly to their own communities. And presumably once they've done that, they don't particularly need Mark anymore. You know, they've got this sort of souped up version of Mark that is that speaks to their own situation.
Because Mark, was it written in Rome? Do we know, for a Roman Christian audience? Do we know?
We don't know anything about where Mark was written. There's a lot of people think Syria, so perhaps somewhere closer to the Roman revolt, sorry, the Jewish revolt against Rome. I actually quite like the Roman idea, because there's a lot in Mark about persecution, and I think that would fit quite well with the persecution under Nero in the 60s. I think it also puts him in a very vibrant, sort of central part of a great book culture where people could very easily get hold of copies of Mark. But it's true that we just don't really know. The earliest evidence linking Mark to Rome is much later than we would ideally have liked. So we've got no really early writers telling us this.
Yes. Does that tradition come from that Peter was his source of information or something like that?
Yes, there's evidence in Papias, who was an early second century writer, and we only have Papias's works because they're preserved by Eusebius in the 4th century. But Eusebius says that Papias says, and he quotes Papias to say that that Mark's gospel was, or at least that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. So we don't quite know what interpreter means. Did he translate for Peter? What was he doing? But that certainly would put the two men very closely together. There are some people, in fact, quite a lot of scholars think that this is just made up by Papias, and that the early church made up the whole connection between Mark and Peter because they wanted to kind of give Peter, or at least because they wanted to give Mark's gospel more status by linking it to Peter. And that's also why it was linked to Rome, as Rome gradually emerged as the central place in the Jerusalem church, that linking Mark with both Peter and Rome sort of gave it more standing. We don't know. I mean, it could be a sort of early Christian sleight of hand, or it could just be a genuine memory. Either are possible.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes. And then sort of my last question would be, after the 70 CE destruction of Jerusalem, do we know what happened to the Jews after that? Was there an intention to rebuild it in the early days, or did life just sort of was not able to go back to normal after that tragic event as the centuries progressed?
Certainly there was an intention, or at least an expectation, that the temple would be rebuilt, because this had all happened before. The temple was destroyed by the Babylonians back in the 6th century. And of course, the Jews had come back from exile and rebuilt their temples. So I think most people would have expected the same to have happened in AD 72. There might be a few years when there wasn't a temple, but the expectation, or at least the hope, would be that the temple would be rebuilt. Gradually, of course, that it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. There was an emperor later on, Justinian, who actually planned to build the temple, but in the end, nothing happened. And as we now know, that was the end of the Jerusalem temple. Of course, for Christians, though, it didn't really matter. And I think a lot of the Christian ideas about the community being the new temple, although they predate the fall of the temple, I think they particularly start to gather strength once the temple has gone, because Christians didn't really need the temple anymore. They weren't offering sacrifice, or at least they thought that Jesus's sacrifice on the cross was all they needed. And they saw themselves as the temple. So I think different Jewish groups probably had different ideas about how far they actually needed the temple to be rebuilt.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen. I think that is all the questions I've thrown at you. Oh, it's been really interesting. Yeah, thank you for your time.
No problem. So what are you doing with all of this? You're making it into a documentary.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've seen the first movie on my YouTube channel. That was more.
I saw a little bit of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was primarily about futurism and eschatology, and I wanted to find out the truths and the falsehoods within it. I interviewed, you may know Simon Woodman or Ian Boxall, some New Testament scholars.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this one is primarily about the Olivet Discourse. I'm weighing up the evidence of, did the Son of Man come in AD 70, or is it a futuristic prediction? And I've broken the whole discourse down into sections, and so I think helping me to understand Mark's intention will go a long way with what he was trying to say. But I suppose a lot of people tend to use Matthew's gospel for this event more than Mark, I've noticed, because Matthew really seems to expand it, I've noticed. Yeah. And
yeah, I think Mark's Mark's gospel is sort of the scholarly go-to because, because of this idea that he's first, whereas I think Matthew is sort of, for most other people, I think Matthew is the one to go to because he's got Mark but extras, and so
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. And I think the one thing that I'm really digging into is that if Jesus did come back in AD 70 in a wrath sort of context, it leaves me wondering, does the Bible give any futuristic predictions at all? I mean, some say the book of Revelation could have been describing events that was in John's lifetime rather than the future. So I'm weighing up, I suppose, the preterism and the futuristic approach with all of that as well. Is all of it to their own audience, or was there some future thing that is yet to come?
yeah. Mm. Mm.
Yeah,
Or both. I mean,
or
stuff
both.
that this is to the own, or because you can like I think Mark has the definite idea that something is going to happen in the future, but it's just a little bit hazy yet. But also talking to his own audience who have certain expectations, perhaps wrong expectations, or expectations that need to be adjusted slightly.
Yes, I've noticed there was a sort of an expectation that Jesus would come back within their own lifetime, and there was almost sort of a sense of disappointment. I think, is it 2 Peter? You get a little bit of that.
Well, there's that really good passage in Mark, actually 9:1, where Jesus says, truly there are some standing here who will see the kingdom of God come in power. And then, well, that was back in the 30s. So what does he mean? Was Jesus just wrong? But then immediately you have the transfiguration. So is that what Jesus means by coming in power, or was he wrong? I mean, it's really difficult to know.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And the thing is, if Jesus was wrong, why does Mark preserve that verse? Why did he not bother with it? He didn't have to record things.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Was the transfiguration the coming in glory? That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because and it's hardly kind of with power. I mean, it's such a small sort of scene, but it is again in this sort of topsy-turvy world of Mark's gospel is that power, coming with having glowing garments in the presence of Moses and Elijah.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Helen. It's been an
All
honor
right.
to meet you and to talk to you. And no, thank you for your book.
Nice.
It's really insightful.
All right, thank you. Let me know when you've got your thing done.
I will send you a link. Will do. Yes.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye then. Bye.